Welcome to another edition or episode of Erik Wait Live. I wanted to have some Irish music on here, but if you've been following my channel for a while, you know I like a little bit of rock and roll. If you've been following me through this Irish whiskey marathon, I got to admit, I am getting a lot more out of it. I am really enjoying it. I've been super excited, really enthusiastic. I have a newfound love in Irish whiskey. I'll admit, I started this Irish whiskey marathon because it's an obligatory category of study in the study of whiskey. I'm gonna admit it. I'll admit it. It was like, okay, I have to check that box, so I'm gonna do it. You know, like classes you take in college. Okay, I gotta take a sociology class. Okay, check that box. But you really weren't necessarily into it. I'll be honest with you. I'm just being honest. That was sort of my introduction to get into Irish whiskey. Because very early in my whiskey journey, I had a few Irish whiskeys from the little minis, and I know it's a category historically super important, obviously, but that was as much exposure I have, and I fell in love with Scotch whiskey. If you're watching this for the first time, I've been to Scotland twice, been to 40 distilleries, got a diploma from the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy. I've been to Kentucky. I've become a big fan of Texas whiskeys. And so this is the first time getting into Irish whiskeys and really going super deep. And I've got plans to do more Irish whiskey stuff next year. I did a series on the business of Scotch whiskey and the history of Scotch whiskey. So I'm going to do a whole series just like that, but that'll come up next year. Now, in looking for resources for Irish whiskey, because there are some good books, but not a ton, but looking for resources on Irish whiskey, I came across a couple things. One thing leading to another. And the first is a Facebook group called Irish Whiskey Fans of America, which then led me to my guest. I'm going to bring on here in just a second, and his podcast and YouTube channel. So, alrighty. So, Barry, welcome to the channel.
Erik, thank you for having me. Excited to be here representing Ireland.
There you go. So, first of all, something I like to do is learn people's background, how they got into this, what you're doing now, talk a little bit about what you've been doing, and then things for the future. So people sometimes assume, okay, he's Irish, or if someone's Scottish, assume that you've always been into whiskey. So how did you get into start off in whiskey?
Erik, my whiskey journey really only started about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. About 4 years ago, actually, believe it or not. Even though I grew up in Ireland, 12 miles from the Middleton Distillery, the famed distillery that gives us Jameson and Redbreast and Powers whiskey and the yellow spot you have in front of you. I grew up very close to that, so I was familiar, obviously, with the distillery. But it wasn't until 4 years ago that I really got interested and in Irish whiskey, in the stories behind Irish whiskey and the history of it. I was living in Ohio. I live in California right now, but I was living in Ohio, and every year I would participate in this fundraising bike ride called Pelotonia, which was all about raising money for cancer research. And you'd have to raise $2,000 or $3,000 every year to participate, and then you get on your bike and you ride 180 miles to raise that money and to complete that cycle. And by the 7th or 8th year of doing this, there were 9,000 people in Columbus, Ohio, participating in this annual ride. And it was massive. But that meant that asking people for money became more and more difficult. Somebody had the good idea, and they suggested to me, why don't you host a whiskey tasting and raise money that way? And I said, well, I don't know anything about whiskey. And they said, but aren't you Irish? And I said, good enough. So I went out and I bought some whiskey and bought some Irish whiskey that I knew nothing about. I just thought those are lovely looking labels. I bought a few bottles, charged people $50 for a tasting, gave all of the money to cancer research, to this fundraiser, and it was an instant success. But of course, people had questions about Irish whiskey that I couldn't answer. So I started researching and Googling and diving into it. And I quickly became obsessed with Irish whiskey. And I started to, I hosted a number of other tastings, and one tasting led to another. And we started to raise a good amount of money, which was great. But I had this long list of questions that I now had to answer about Irish whiskey. And so to answer them, as I did my research, I decided I'd shoot a few videos, record my answer, send the video onto the attendees, and that would give them their answer. Well, I did this for probably 6 months or 8 months. And before you knew it, I had Irish whiskey brands saw my YouTube videos that I had recorded, and they asked if they could support my fundraising efforts. And so one thing led to another. We started doing more and more fundraising whiskey tastings, all centered, of course, around Irish whiskey. And I felt uniquely qualified to talk about Irish whiskey for only one reason: geography. I grew up in Ireland, and that was my qualification. I wasn't.
Yeah, you got the accent. You got the accent.
That's it. I have the accent. So even if I make up a lie or a white lie or a mistruth, nobody will know because I've got the accent. So I kept doing these tastings, and eventually I realized, look, there's interest beyond the tastings I'm doing. People online started showing interest, so I created a platform called Stories and Sips, where the goal I had was to share not just reviews of whiskey, not just the academic side of whiskey, of which I'm in no way qualified to talk about, but rather share the stories of maybe the towns, the people, the history of Irish whiskey, which I find endlessly fascinating. And so I did. And I started shooting this channel, and I would release whiskey videos every week. And then I turned it into a podcast, and eventually started a Facebook group called Irish Whiskey Fans of America. And it started to grow and grow and grow. And today we find ourselves with 5,500 members. I've got a platform where we do weekly podcasts on Irish whiskey. We've got a live stream every Friday night where anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people over the course of a week will tune in. And we're building a community around Irish whiskey, which I think is perhaps long overdue in the United States.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for those who are watching, down in the description box below is a link to Barry's podcast and website. I've been listening, the best time for me for listening to podcasts is the commute to and from work. And maybe not so much when I'm sitting around the house, but I don't want, because the radio, it's politics, or COVID. Oh, we're on fire. Here in California. So I got to tune all that out, and it's one of the best ways for me to consume information where I don't have to watch and I can listen. So I've actually been listening to the podcast and really, really, really enjoying it. So the other thing is, and if someone, maybe you're new to Irish whiskey, but you're thinking, Erik seems awfully excited about it. He seems to be going nutso, although maybe he's always like that. Check out look on Facebook if you have Facebook, the Irish Whiskey Fans of America, because I came in, even though, I'm pretty steeped in whiskey. Hello. But to Irish whiskey, I was still a newbie. And so I was able to ask questions, and boom, really, really, really quick, I got really, really, really good answers.
Yeah.
For example, one of the questions I had actually, and I put it in some of the information actually into one of my recent videos, is that there isn't a blended malt category for Irish whiskeys. And I talked about that in the video, but some of the information that I got that I used in that video I actually got from the group. So it's a great place not only to share what you're currently enjoying, but to ask questions and find out about other resources, which is how, of course, I met you. So
that's right.
highly recommend checking out the group and start exploring Irish whiskeys. So first of all, I've got a little bit of the yellow spot. My review will be coming out tomorrow. Really, really enjoying this dram, although I like the Chateau Barton more. But I would say this is sweeter. And for me, if you just had a real spicy dinner, maybe garlic, maybe pesto, something like that, this is really good afterwards. So the same place you might have a Sauterne or a late harvest wine or something like that. It has that same sort of, for me, that filler that really, really cleans the palate and leaves you with a little bit of sweetness there, something you'd have after dinner. I found the Barton to be a little more chocolatey, a little more dark black fruit notes, which for me, because it's not as intensely sweet. This is also very floral too.
It is.
It's not as intensely sweet. I think it has a broader play. But anyway, about that particular scene. So what do you have in your glass, sir?
Right now, I'm drinking I made an old fashioned before I came on with Redbreast 12-year-old cask strength.
Ooh.
And I'm a big fan of putting very good whiskeys into cocktails because I think the better the ingredient, the better the cocktail. But I've also got my sipping glass on standby because I'm going to imagine there'll be more whiskeys to be enjoyed over the course of the next 8 or 9 hours of our live stream here.
All right, so with someone we talked about a little bit before we went live. So you've been into whiskey about 3 years. I've been since April 2016. And of course, it started off slow and it's built up momentum to the point to where I'm not even doing wine reviews anymore. And in the wine community, it's like, what the heck happened to Erik? And my focus has been completely on whiskey. But there's been this growing community on YouTube of whiskey tubers, and we're all getting to know each other. We're friends. We meet up. We're on each other's channels. So over in Scotland, of course, you have Ralphie, who's the original. He's sort of the Yoda, the Jedi Master Yoda.
That's right.
Roy Aquavite over in Glasgow. Here in the United States, we have Scotch Test Dummies, Scotch 4 Dummies. Of course, the Whiskey Vault. Now, Daniel Weddington of the Whiskey Vault, the very earliest videos are in Irish whiskey, and they do Irish whiskeys here and there. Then we have a big bourbon community, sort of a subcategory. It's Bourbon Night, Bourbon Junkies. Mash and Drum focuses mostly on bourbons. The Whiskey Dictionary, Bill, the Whiskey Dictionary, he around St. Patrick's Day, he'll do a series on Irish whiskeys. Bourbon Insane, Chris. I know I'm rattling a bunch of names. I'm going to make a point here rather than just plugging everybody. The Whiskey Hound, over there in England, we have a Glaswegian by the name of Whiskey Friend. In Ireland, Whiskey Novice, but he doesn't focus on Irish whiskeys, although he's done some. Vin PF over in England, no nonsense whiskey, mostly Scotch. And the Whiskey Straight Out, also in Ireland, but he doesn't focus on Irish whiskey. Now, I name all these guys and these people because there's some women in there as well. I Whiskey She Wines, Bobby and Sam, they're in Kentucky. Is everything I just mentioned, everybody I just mentioned is either Scotch,
right,
or bourbon. And the Whiskey Vault, they sprinkle in some Irish whiskeys. Bill, the Whiskey Dictionary, sprinkle in some Irish whiskeys. But there's no, and I've heard you use the term evangelist on videos. I'm an evangelist for Irish whiskeys. There isn't somebody who is the voice, or at least a major voice, for Irish whiskey in this community, and this growing interconnected community for Irish whiskey. Now, I'm sort of an unofficial ambassador for Texas.
Isn't that why you have me here? Isn't that why I'm here?
Well, I did a 3-month series on Texas whiskeys, and I have a whole bunch of them over here somewhere.
That's a deep dive.
But I think you are needed. I think you're needed to be, if not the voice, at least a major voice, and bring a contribution to this. Sometimes people call it the whiskey fabric. To bring a contribution. And I would really like to see more engagement with, and I know you're busy, we're all busy, but I'd like to see you represent them. I'd like to see the group grow more. I would like to see these things that I am falling in love with and my enthusiasm for these whiskeys. And I've got a lot more to go. I'll be doing this at least till the end of October, maybe heading into November.
Some man, fair play to you.
I think you need to become the patron saint of Irish whiskey to the Whiskey Tuber world.
Listen, patron saint, those aren't words that I could use myself, but if you want to use them, fine. I will take those words and I will use them, and I will do my best to evangelize and go throughout the country waving bottles of Irish whiskey at everybody who listen, and even those who don't, until they remove bourbons and scotches from their shelf to make space for the joy that is Irish whiskey. Because look, let's face it, you have been doing remarkable work deep diving into Texas whiskeys and Scotch and bourbon, but we can all agree that if it wasn't for the Irish back in the 1300s, there'd be no such thing as whiskey at all. So you're welcome for that, but it is time for us to come back and for us to evangelize more this thing that we created.
Absolutely. And I think one of the problems is sometimes once somebody gets their head in their idea about something, it could be, so if the only Italian wine they had is that bulbous one that comes in the little wicker basket, the very, very, very cheap, and that's what they had, and they're like, ooh, I don't like that. And then they never touch an Italian wine again. they
Right.
kind of doing a disservice to Italian wines. And I think the same thing with Irish whiskeys. If all they've had is, say, the less expensive stuff that see stacks and stacks and stacks of at St. Patrick's Day in the grocery store.
Yes.
You know, you walk into the grocery, and I like Jameson, don't get me wrong, but if that's all you've ever had, and that's the thought you have in your head that that's what Irish whiskey is, and that's the representation of Irish whiskey,
Right.
like I say, there's so much more to explore there, and it's not whiskeys trying to be like Scotch. They're distinctive, they're unique, they have their own character, and they're absolutely fantastic.
Well, Eric, the reality is that how whiskey is consumed in Ireland is very different than how whiskey is consumed in the United States. And my observation over the past few years is that most Americans' introduction to Irish whiskey has been through Jameson. And sometimes that happens lying on the floor of the bar at 2:00 in the morning when somebody hands them a shot glass and says, here's a good idea. In Ireland, we don't shoot our whiskey. You know, we sit back and we sip and we savor. And we'd like to say that for every year that whiskey has spent in the barrel, it spends a second in our mouth. So we take our time with whiskey and we tell stories and we chat and we connect over it. Now, I'm not going to in any way lambast the fantastic consumption of Irish whiskey through Jameson in America, because it has really laid the groundwork and opened the doors and cleared the avenues for the new distilleries that have come along that now stand on the shoulders of Jameson. So we're a small country, a small craggy island off the west coast of Europe that, while we invented whiskey, world events over the last 200 years changed our trajectory, reduced our capacity to distill, reduced our distribution. But over the past 20, 30 years, there's been a remarkable double-digit growth in Irish whiskey. Jameson is predominantly leading that charge, but there are now 33 distilleries on the island of Ireland. There was there was 2 on the entire island when I was growing up in Ireland in the 1980s. So that's a remarkable shift. So if we don't see a massive conversation happening on YouTube right now, mark my words, it's coming, and we're seeing more and more original content being created around it. Because I will say this, we're very proud of our whiskey in Ireland, and it's only a matter of time before more people decide to turn on the camera, press record, and just wax lyrical about this beautiful drop of whiskey.
So when you were young, there would have been Middleton and what, Cooley?
Bushmills in Northern Ireland.
Okay, way up north?
Way up in the north. So on 2 coasts. Yeah, so on the island of Ireland, which if you look at a map, looks like a little teddy bear with its arms outstretched to America. On the north coast, County Antrim coast, you have Bushmills Distillery, which has been around in some form since 1608. And on the south coast, you've got the Middleton Distillery, 12 miles from Cork City, which has been around since 1825. Those are the 2 distilleries that survived it all, that through thick and thin have managed to keep going. But there was a time in the 1800s when there was more than 100 distilleries on the island of Ireland. And now we're creeping back towards that. Like at the current rate of growth, it's estimated that by 2025, if we can keep this growth going, sales of Irish whiskey in the United States will outpace Scotch by 2025, which will be a day for a party, let me tell you, and you're invited.
Awesome. So my only thing is I need more livers.
Just get a copper liver.
Yeah. So in spending 20 years in wine and basically having to get all the certifications and so forth, to studying the entire world of wine, I'm a big fan of Bordeaux and I'm a big fan of my home state, California, but you need to learn everything. While I may pick a favorite whiskey region, I'm a big peated whiskey fan, or style. I have to, in some sense, try to at least get a really good grasp on it all, on the whole world of it. And for me, a very, very important, because of the way my brain works, it has to be visual, which means memorizing maps.
Okay.
A lot of studying wine and studying wine classifications and grapes is studying maps. And so when I think of I know people, Eric's talking about wine, you're supposed to be talking about whiskey.
Yeah,
that's where I come from. So when I think about Bordeaux and I'm tasting a Bordeaux, a map pops into my head, and the Gironde and the region and the soils and the grapes and the gravity and everything else, and the gravelly rocks and the soils and all that. So I have a map of Irish distilleries on my I have 2 screens, and as I want, it'll be nothing but that map. And I'm constantly staring at it. I'm inserting that map into my head so that I'll memorize that map. And then I'll start having the associations for the very distilleries and the whiskeys associated that map. And so eventually, hopefully, Lord willing, next year when I get over there, then I will sort of get the in-person 3-dimensional orientation with that. So
it's a good way of doing it. And Ireland at the moment is in this spurt of growth with distilleries, and it can be confusing. It can be confusing for us who know a little bit about whiskey, but it's even more confusing for the consumer. And the reason is, as you well know, Irish whiskey needs to be a minimum of 3 years in a wooden barrel before it can be called whiskey, Irish whiskey. Most whiskeys will spend a lot longer than that in the barrel. Well, that means for new distilleries who have opened up, they have a choice. They can either source whiskey from an established distillery, relabel it, sell it as their brand name, or they can make gin or vodka and wait and then release it when it's ready. So what you have now in Ireland is you've got this remarkable scattering of 33 distilleries across the island that all have whiskey for sale, but only half of them, or not even half of them, produce that whiskey themselves. So when you start looking for styles of whiskey, or you start comparing it to regions like in Scotland and start to look for, well, where's the West Coast influence and where's the South Coast influence? The reality is that doesn't exist yet. Okay. What we do, because mostly what you have in Ireland are whiskies that have come from 3, 4, 5 distilleries in Ireland, and those make up the majority of the whiskey that's in the market today. Now, if we talk again in 10 years' time, we're going to be drinking whiskey from 33 or 40 distilleries, which is good. But it is a little bit confusing because people are wondering, well, if Scotland has Islay and Lowlands and Highlands, what's Ireland's equivalent? And the reality is that we don't have an equivalent yet, because we don't know if the West Coast produces a different style, or if the sea conditions on the Atlantic Ocean, where the waves crash against the West Coast, give a different salty finish to barrels that mature within a mile of the coast. We don't know. So that's all to be determined. But the good news is that these are all things that we have yet to find out. And the worst news of all would be if we didn't have 33 distilleries and we were back to just the 2 that were there when I was growing up.
So I was listening to, I'm trying to look for the name of the gentleman, O'Connell, I think was the last name. Someone you recently had on a podcast, and he was talking about he had been over in Hong Kong. I see the first name, but I don't know how to pronounce it.
Dahi.
And his last name is
Dahi O'Connell.
O'Connell. Okay, I got the last name.
That's right. Yes.
I didn't want to butcher his first name. I do that with a lot.
It's a tough one. Dahi. Yeah.
So, but he was talking about, and I got excited about perhaps, I don't know if he's already doing it or not, making a peated whiskey as part of the profile.
He has it. I have it here on the shelf behind me. There is a distillery called the Great Northern Distillery, which was founded by John Teeling, who famously founded the Cooley Distillery. His sons went on to found the Teeling Distillery in Dublin. John Teeling is a force of nature and really the godfather of the modern Irish whiskey renaissance. John Teeling and the Great Northern Distillery produce peated single malts, and Dahi has sourced his liquid, his whiskey, from Great Northern. And so Dahi calls himself a whiskey merchant. And a whiskey merchant is that middleman really between the distillery and the consumer, who will package it up, or he will ask the distillery to finish it a certain way, or he will be part of the, perhaps his insights will guide the maturation and the finish, and then he'll have a product that will be different than what the distillery might produce, because Great Northern Distillery is a third-party distillery. They really don't make their own products. So they're relying on everybody else to buy from them. And so when you go to Costco or you go to chains in the United States, they might have their own whiskeys, but there's a very good chance that it came from the Great Northern Distillery. And Dahi is one of those people who got his whiskey from there. Right.
So in the wine world, this is common. And the French word for it is négociant.
Yes.
And I'm not going to go on and give you a lecture on that, but it's very, very, very common. Or you don't have enough grapes to fulfill all your production. So you have your estate wines, and then you have other wines that you've sourced from maybe all over California or throughout Burgundy, because you can't get enough to fulfill your needs. So in terms of sourcing, the idea of sourcing isn't strange and odd or something looked down upon. They got to source now until they get to make their own. No. Sourcing has always been there. Here in, of course, the United States, we have NGP. Then, so in the Napa Valley, you have the Beckstoffer vineyards, and you have maybe 6, 7, 8 wineries that source grapes from those particular vineyards, and then how they do the cask, how they do the aging, the yeast, and whatever else they do to those grapes, the maceration, everything else, makes something distinct from those grapes, even though they're from the same vineyard. And so something parallel to that in sourcing spirit and so forth, and then doing something unique to it to produce your profile of your whiskey. So
that's
this
right.
is something strange and odd. I'm just trying to get the people watching this. This is common. It's common in Scotland as well. It's common here in the United States. And I don't have a problem with it when you realize that the choices of the blending, the choices of the cask, the choices of whatever else they do to it is made by, unless they're just 100% just going, okay, we bought this 100% and just stick our label on it. But if they're doing something else to it, in Texas, a lot of spirit comes out from outside of Texas, and then it's aged in Texas, and it has the Texas stamp on it due to the unique climate there. Anyway, so there's something similar to that going on there in Ireland.
Yeah, well, that's how it was for hundreds of years in Ireland. We had what were called whiskey bonders, and it might surprise some of the audience to know that it wasn't until the 1960s that most distilleries in Ireland actually bottled their own whiskey. Until that point, even Jameson, until the 1960s, were selling their whiskey in barrels. You either brought your own barrel, they filled it up, or they sold you a barrel of their own. And the whiskey bonders were this middle merchant or middleman who had a bond, which is really just a promise to the government. And a bond is basically a promise to the government that you'll buy the whiskey from the distillery and you won't pay the tax due on it until you sell it to the consumer, but you promise the government that at that point you'll give them the tax. So these whiskey bonders would buy barrels of whiskey, and look, for example, Redbreast is a whiskey bonder brand from dating back from the early 1900s that came about from a whiskey bonder, which was a wine merchant called Gilbey's, who brought their barrels over to the old Jameson Bow Street distillery and had them filled up. So it's a very common practice. And if you drove through Ireland in the early 1900s and for much of the 20th century, you would have seen many bars and grocery stores that were also in the business of bottling whiskey. So they would have bought their barrels and they would have bottled it. They would have put the name Jameson on it, but it would have had the name of the grocery store or the name of the bar on it as well. And it was very common practice. And it wasn't until the 1960s that distilleries, there was only a handful of distilleries left at this stage in Ireland, but they took it back in-house to control quality. That left this period between the 1960s and the last few years where you only had the Middleton Distillery, Bushmills Distillery, Cooley Distillery producing. So when new brands came about and started to bottle their own whiskey, I would hate to have been one of these brands over the last 10 years, because every time they introduced their whiskey, somebody would say, but what distillery did it come from? As if they had no hand themselves as a whiskey merchant in adding value to the equation. And they always do add value, whether it's their choice of casks to finish it in or added maturation or whatever it might be. So it's a question that all these whiskey bonders and merchants are plagued with on a daily basis. What's the source of your liquid? What's the source of your whiskey? And the reality is that, look, it doesn't matter where it comes from in Ireland right now. There isn't a bad distillery making whiskey, which we're very proud of. But it was a historical norm. It's going to be a present day norm once we can get over our insecurities about sourced whiskey. It's a good thing because it allows Irish whiskey to go further, and it allows whiskey merchants and bonders to do things that a distillery can't do, won't do, and doesn't want to do.
So, by the way, so one of the tricks of doing live streams is when one person's talking, the other one can drink, and then when the other person, so that's where you can get a sip and quench the thirst.
Well, I'll join you.
Oh, there you go. So I'm very methodic and almost scientific in my approach to studying things. And so I started off purposely with just Middleton, just to become familiar with Middleton. So I've started off with the Middleton, very rare, start high, and then went Jameson, the much more affordable, much more budget. And then, of course, I did the number of 3 different Redbreasts. Then the Powers 12, man, that one really knocked my socks off.
That's great.
And then the Green Spot, Beaubaton. I just bought today the Chateau Montelena, and of course here on the Yellow Spot. Anyway, and the thing that, among other things, is just how if I was doing these blind and not told they all come from Middleton, I would never have guessed. There is a certain commonality in terms of like a distant cousin between them, and yet they're very, 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 very unique and very, 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 very distinct. I would say this one, I get more maltiness on the back and than I have on some of the other ones. And it's very sweeter. It has a completely different profile. So, and the choices that they're making, and the ABVs aren't all the same. So even though just like, different wineries doing different Beckstoffer vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon, and yet they come out different, it's very, 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 very same. So it's interesting to really explore one particular distillery and realize just how much difference comes about because of the choices that the individual brands are making and
That's right.
into the bottle. So,
I mean, the Middleton Distillery, of course, I mean, look, they've got 60 plus different expressions that come out of the same stills. And
wow.
To your point, it's the variations and the decisions they make at 100 different points of forks in the road that determine what that spirit eventually becomes.
Right. And it's not just casting at the end and what's being slapped on at the end. I'm reading a little bit here. I'm still going to, so if they were, okay, we're working in the distillery. Okay, we're doing a batch now, and this is going to go into powers. This is going to go into something else. Do they then start doing cuts different? Do you know if they start at speeds or anything else different other than just casking, or what if everything in the distilling itself might be different?
Yeah. So if we take the Middleton Distillery, and again, I'm going to be practicing without a license by giving you some of this information because I'm not an academic or qualified to talk about it. But I have spent a lot of time being as curious as you have, Eric, about the process and asking the questions of those in the distillery. At the Middleton Distillery, it's known for producing single pot still whiskey. That is the bulk of what is produced there. It makes grain whiskey, a corn whiskey, of course, as well, that becomes blended, that gets blended with the pot still to make our Jameson and our Paddy and Powers, Gold Label, etc. But let's focus on the pot still component. So you've got this style of Irish whiskey, unique to Ireland, Irish single pot still. Within the Middleton Distillery, there are a number of types of single pot still. And what I mean by types of pot still, I mean there are different weights of pot still, different mash bills, different percentage quantities of unmalted versus malted barley, different cuts, different lengths of distillation, different heats. There are, and they have different names. So there's things like trad pot, which means the traditional pot still, and there's 3 or 4 different names they have for these types of pot still. And when I asked the assistant blender, Dave McCabe from Middleton one time, I asked him, how many weeks a year do you distill Redbreast? And he leaned in close to me in a uniquely Irish way. And he said, when the spirit comes off the still, it doesn't yet know what it's going to be. And that floored me. I didn't know what to make of that. I said, you have to explain that to me. I thought that was both poetic and equally confusing and poetic at the same time. And he said, the distillation piece is just one of the many factors that determine where that spirit ends up. So pot still whiskey that comes off the still, depending on the style of pot still that it is, may end up being blended with a grain whiskey to become Jameson. It may end up becoming a Redbreast based on the sherry, Oloroso sherry and ex-bourbon casks it lives in for a certain number of years. It may end up becoming a Powers if it stays predominantly in bourbon casks. It may become a Middleton very rare Dargaelach if it is only in bourbon casks, and then eventually virgin Irish oak. So there's all these decisions that have to be made. And so there's this beautiful balance. I guess this happens in every distillery in every part of the world, but it's this beautiful, delicate dance between the science of distillation and then the art of maturation and blending and cask selection and recasking and maturing, and then ultimately vatting what casks that had pot still do we want to bring together. For example, for Redbreast 12-year-old, do we want 75% spirit that was in ex-bourbon mixed with 25% spirit that was in ex-Oloroso sherry? And is that the right percentage, or is it 24-76? And so those decisions come down to the art of maturing and the art of blending and the art of nosing that whiskey. So you've got these same stills producing all these styles, but the distillation is only the start of that process of determining whether something will fit the profile of a Powers whiskey. And somebody on my live stream the other night asked, how did, for example, Redbreast 27, which I have here, which is a Redbreast that has 27-year-old whiskey that was in port pipes as well as 27-year-old whiskey that was in bourbon and sherry. But somebody asked, how come that became a Redbreast and didn't become a Powers or didn't become Middleton? And the answer is that there's a very specific profile that fits each brand. And port would not be used for Powers today. It wouldn't be used for Middleton today. It wouldn't be used for Jameson today. It might have been historically, but Redbreast has a backbone of fortified wines. And so port fits in with the sherry, fortified wine, Oloroso sherry contribution that Redbreast is known for. So it's remarkable how many different expressions, brands, styles can come out of the same stills. But that bit after the distillation, I think, is the thing that's most exciting to me.
So, so you've been here in the United States, like you said, around 10 years?
14 years now.
Okay. So you started off, you were in Ohio and then you moved out here to the left coast?
Yeah, that's right.
So have you been, I grew up here, I can call it that. So have you been back to Ireland since you've been here? I'm sure you have.
Yeah. I mean, until this year, I go back 3 or 4 times a year. My family are there. So, and now the growing whiskey community that I've gotten to know through online efforts with this, I've become very close friends with people in Ireland. But yeah, I go back there often, but I haven't been back there now since November last year, sadly. So
maybe next year, if things clear up, me and you, or you and I, we can head over there together and you can show me around, because that kind of leads me to my next question then. I love California, I love California wines, but when I went to France and went to Bordeaux and visited the chateau there, I fell in love with, I was already a Francophile, but I fell in love with, more in love with Bordeaux. When I went to Scotland, same experience. And now I'm anticipating, I'm sort of, I have I have more of a harem of whiskeys.
Yes.
and loves. I'm more like a harem than a single one. I'm kind of like King Solomon with his 1,000 wives. but with whiskeys. So if in terms of now, and that things are changing so much in Ireland, I'm finding it's a little more challenging to try to plan a trip, where you should go, right? What I should visit, what's available. Now, let's pretend all the COVID crap is gone and things are back to the way they were in terms of visiting. There's so you have Middleton, Cooley, Bushmills, and in terms of the big ones, and then maybe Kilbeggan, which is sort of in the middle of Ireland, and then there's these new ones popping up, like may mispronounce it, Glendalough. I tell you, it's great up. Teeling as well. So, what would be your recommendation if someone's for the first time going over to Scotland? Going over to Ireland. I know. At least I didn't say Kentucky.
I'm leaving.
Going over to Ireland first time and want to do some exploration of Ireland, going to visit. Do you have any particular recommendations?
Look, I think Ireland is different to anywhere else on earth. And of course I'm going to say that. The Irishman, the fellow with the accent coming on here, defending his own country. But Ireland is a bit of a state of mind. It's not just a country. So you have to get into the state of mind. And the state of mind in Ireland is laid back. There's a little bit of go with the flow, where the best laid plans get waylaid for the best reasons. Because you suddenly discover you're locked into a pub. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. For some reason, you don't have a shirt on, but it's okay because you're part of something remarkable that's happening and you're just going to go with it. And you had plans the next day, but they're now scuppered because something else has come up, and that's good. So what I would say is it's going to take a few trips to Ireland to truly appreciate all of that. What I would say is focus on one area, one region. Maybe it's the south of Ireland. Maybe you settle yourself in Kerry and the southwest coast, or in Cork and the south coast, and you explore the 4, 5, 6 distilleries that are within a 2-hour drive of your base there. And I would spend the rest of my time in the pubs drinking the whiskey from around Ireland and talking to the locals about it. Because what will happen is, no matter what you read or discovered or wanted to see, somebody will say something to you that changes everything. And life will never be the same because of it. So I would say give yourself at least a week, but in a very small region. 2 weeks, brilliant. If you can do 2 weeks, perfect, even better. And let yourself a few days there where nothing's planned, so that when the inevitable happens and somebody says, I have a cousin that's driving that way tomorrow, you should jump in the car with them. You do it and you don't ask any questions. And it's as simple as that. You'll be safe, you'll be fine. And the good news is that There's no natural predators in Ireland for humans, so you could sleep on a field, and there's no bears, and there's nothing can attack you. The only thing to be afraid of is another human, but you'll be safe. You'll be fine in Ireland.
I might need a translator when I go over there.
You might.
I have found, so there is a certain tuning of the ear. So Alan, who goes by Whiskey Friend, he's from Glasgow, but he lives in Manchester. When I talk to him, there's a time in which he says something, and then there's a time in which I understood what it was he said. There's sort of this, and so if a joke is made, you might seem like stare in my face.
Just look for the.
Now you've been here in the United States a little longer, so you're easier to understand. But I noticed from some of your podcasts, I had to like back it up. What was that? What was that?
Right.
Of course, there's phrases and terminology and stuff like that that get used as well. That's distinctive of a particular region. Scott from Scotch Test Dummies, he uses terminology. He's up there in Kansas that I've only heard my mom use because my mom was from Fort Scott, Kansas. Okay. So little Kansas phrases, and so, but I find that that's very interesting.
Same in Ireland.
One of the good things of listening to the podcast is to tune my ear to understand, pick up phrases and terms, and maybe I got to Google it, find out what the heck that meant, as well as the content and the information. But I've been listening to, for me, when I get into wine, it's not just what's in the glass, it's the culture, it's the history, it's art, it's music, it's the language. Even though I don't speak a whole lot of French, when I'm over there, I'm listening to French radio, watching television. When I was in Scotland traveling, I'm listening to the BBC has a Gaelic station and channels. Even though I don't understand the word they're saying, it's part of it. So I've been listening to Irish music, including what they call like canticles, which is more like spiritual music, folk music.
Yep.
Rock and roll, Irish rock and music, played a little bit at the introduction here. And then it was awesome. So unfortunately, I came home from work, fell asleep, so I missed this week's live stream, but I watched on the replay. But last week you had, I can't remember what his name was, and he had a little hand drum, and he was singing songs in between. You had a rep from Kilbeggan.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
you had a gentleman. He would come on and he would sing a song. He was fantastic.
He was great, wasn't he? Paddy Holman. Yeah, he was great.
Absolutely fantastic. And that puts me into the mood as much as you can, and the setting. And you said earlier the word mindset. The mindset of it is to get into the culture, history. I wish I could get into the climate right now because it's hot here.
I know. Oh, I know. Well, like you mentioned something that's very important there, which, music is one of those very important things. Whiskey can't be consumed in a vacuum. Whiskey is part of the culture, but you drink it with friends. You drink it when you're out. Like I have shelves full of whiskey behind me that aren't being touched very much right now because I'm here in my house, not with whiskey drinking friends who I'd enjoy it with. And it's the same in Ireland. Music, culture, the pub, the 10, 15 friends that you might meet out on a night are all part of it, and they're an integral part of it. And to me, whiskey is about bringing people together and immersing yourself into a community and connecting over something you might all enjoy. And music just makes it so much better.
Absolutely. So when I was up in Speyside, and I was at the it was called the Copper Dog. It was a bar and restaurant, part of the Cogallica Hotel. And I was hanging out in the bar, and there was a couple there doing Scottish folk music. You wish you could take that, put it in your pocket, and take it home with you.
I know.
And sit at home, take it out of your pocket, and go boo right here, and be part of the atmosphere that you have back at home. Because the context of enjoying the whiskey, that's part of the context of enjoying whiskey. And there's nothing like actually being there. And it's why it makes me one more eager to go there. And like you said, your recommendation is don't just do all this running around to distilleries.
Yeah.
Hang out in the pubs, get part of it, sort of enveloped in the culture, listen to the stories that are being told, hear the music that's being played. And if you got to crawl out your way out at the end to make yourself to get back to your hotel room, that's it.
That's the beauty of it. I get asked, I did before COVID hit, I was asked on a regular basis for recommendations on where people should go when they visit Ireland and help them plan their trips. And they'd always come to you with their 7 days or their 5 days or their 10 days mapped out down to the minute. And my first recommendation would be, take that piece of paper now and set fire to it in front of me, because I want to make sure you do not follow those textbook recommendations you've set for yourself. Because what you want is, you want those days of nothing planned. So that you talk about context. Irish music can't really be bottled perfectly. While it can travel, it is about context. It's about you rolling into a pub and it's quiet, and there's one man at the bar with his long coat and his paddy hat on him, and he's sitting there sipping his Guinness, and he's a small whiskey beside it. And maybe you start a small chat. And then 3 hours later, it's 10 deep at the bar. 15 people are playing instruments in the corner. The floor is jumping up and down. That can't be planned. And you just have to be in the right place for that to happen. And if you're stuck in your car driving from distillery to distillery, and you won't be able to drink and enjoy because you're driving, you'll miss out on what we would say is uniquely Irish. Because the whiskey you'll drink in a distillery will probably taste the same as the whiskey you'll drink right there in your room where you are. But when you take it in a pub with new friends and there's music in the background and you're a stone's throw from your hotel so you can crawl home at night, you'll never forget those days. That's what it's all about.
There is a whiskey bar in the Soho district in London called Milroy's. Mm-hmm. And it's a hole in the wall place, super narrow. It's not much bigger than my kitchen, and then it has
a great bar.
Oh, have you been there?
Yeah, I know Milroy's well. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So Eddie, one of the main gentlemen there, and you go to the back and you push open this bookcase, and then you go down to the speakeasy down below, which is they do more cocktails down below. But I love hanging out there. I've been there twice, hanging out there, because you meet people. It gets your elbow to elbow.
That's right.
People crammed in there, and have you tried it? Here, try this. Oh, have you tried this? You tried this? And the conversations that roll, and just
that's special.
And I'm like, there is nothing. I love California, but there's nothing. I look. I'm like, I hate to say this, but most bars that I ever went in, I'm not a bar person. It's a place people go there to pick up chicks.
right.
Which isn't a bad thing necessarily.
In Ireland, we're going there to pick up whiskey.
Yes,
and we do it well.
And so, in fact, the Gentleman OConnell, that's where he met his partner.
That's right. Yeah.
Met her in a bar. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But it's a young dudes hanging out, on the night, a Friday night, Saturday night kind of thing. I'm an older man. I'm not looking for love in all the wrong places. But really, this really makes me more and more want to go to Ireland. And I think
you and me both.
2 weeks will not be enough. 2 weeks.
No. My wife, who's from the United States, is in love with Ireland as well, and thankfully, now that she's married to an Irishman. But we've spent extended periods of time over there, maybe a month at a time, and it's allowed her the opportunity to immerse herself into Irish culture and into what really Ireland is. And she's seen that side of it, which is not what you'd find in a book, but what you find at the bar when there were no plans, or when somebody rolls up next to you. Like, I'll give you one example. Down in Dingle, a beautiful town that we love in the southwest coast of Ireland, there's a fantastic whiskey bar, has won awards for being Ireland's best whiskey bar. It's called dickmax pub. And we've rolled into dickmax when we've been down in Dingle and we've sat at the bar, and next thing a stool will open up next to you and somebody will sit down there and they'll start chatting. And 5 hours later, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're still in the pub, and you will never forget those nights. So yeah, the longer you can spend there and the more free time you give yourself, the more the magic will find its way into your life.
So this is the question that comes to my mind is, so I had a next door neighbor for a while. When I was living in the Bay Area. He was from Hamilton, Scotland, which is south of Glasgow. His wife is from Waco, Texas. And they met up this is sound funny. They met through a matchmaker in New York, a Jewish matchmaker in New York, even though they're not Jewish. Anyway, so they now live in Waco, Texas, because they end up having like 12 kids and they needed more room. Yeah. So I asked him, why did you? I'm trying to get this open here. Hold on, I'm gonna get me a knife. I'll be right back. Hold on. Why did you leave Scotland? He says Texas was his third favorite country. First Scotland, then the United States, and then Texas. I said, so why did you leave Scotland? And his answer was economic ability, economic prosperity,
Yeah.
economically. So the question I got to go, if Ireland is such a fantastic place, why did you leave Ireland?
Well, I left Ireland because I actually grew a business from Ireland that expanded to Europe, and I eventually expanded to the United States. And I had a small software business that I moved over here, and I grew it in the United States. So if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have landed on these shores. So I'm thankful for that opportunity. But I fell in love with the people here, and I've found that an Irish accent in America, it means a little bit more than an Irish accent in Ireland, and so I've traded on that little bit of Irishness while I've been over here.
It's funny you should say that. So I talked before we went on screen. I was in the Marine Corps long time ago, and went to boot camp down there in San Diego, and then went to military police school. But the military police school was on an Air Force base. In a class, it's a military police academy, and a class of 30. Maybe 5 of us Marines and the rest were Air Force airmen. So on that base, as a Marine, you were distinct and unique, and you stood out. Once I got to Camp Pendleton, which at the time had 50,000 Marines.
It's big.
So what? You're a Marine. So what? There's 49,000 other, a lot of them. So, so you're, they're a dime a dozen. But I could see being here, being Irish or being French or German, someplace else. It does make you unique, gives you a unique voice, a unique perspective, and to do something here in.
That's it. And look, I often say, I don't do the hard work. I only open the bottles. It's the hard work has gone into the producing of these beautiful whiskeys that I get to talk about and share and drink with people. But I'm curious to know, Erik, from your side, like as you've got into Irish whiskey now, and you're familiar with other regions, like what questions have come up for you about Irish whiskey, or what stands out as being different or kind of even confusing about Irish whiskey to you?
So one of the things I'm working on, so in my approach to things, I study maps, I study locations, I get associations with places and maps, and so it's just the way it works. So when I first went down to Texas to visit Texas distilleries, I met up with Daniel Weddington, and he was going to pour me something. I said, I only want to taste Texas whiskeys while I'm here because I want that association. Very early in my wine journey, if I went to the Santa Cruz Mountains and maybe they produce 10% comes from the Santa Cruz Mountains, the rest comes from Napa, I would only taste what comes from the Santa Cruz Mountains. So it's to get the associations and there. So in doing and not only you get the associations, but you find this is what this place tastes like beyond whatever grapes you're using. So what I'm working on now is I'm becoming familiar with Middleton. What does Middleton produce? They produce boom, 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 boom. Here are the brands. Now, by the time I'm in, if this goes into end of October, maybe into November, maybe who knows, the end of the year. In my mind, what I'm working on is what is distinctive about Irish whiskey versus Scotch versus Canada versus Japan or something like that. And so I'm not down the road enough to be able to answer that question. Because I'm still working on it. I still need more distilleries to go through, more to go through. But I'm working on developing this profile in my head. But at this juncture, one of the main things that's standing out is texture. The distinctive texture of Irish whiskeys. And this is not only just to understand Irish whiskey, but if you were to do a blind tasting, what would make this distinction from, say, a Japanese whiskey? Because anyway, so what would you say? And maybe something very, very, very general, or maybe there's too much uniqueness to make any sort of general statement, because that's a possibility. But is there anything that you would say, here is a general commonality that is unique or distinctive of Irish whiskey?
Well, look, you've hit on something very important. You've hit on texture. You've hit on that feel of the whiskey in the mouth. When you drink Irish whiskey is different than when you drink a Scotch or a Japanese or a bourbon. The texture you're getting, and we should hone in here. Why you're getting this is you're focused right now on the Middleton whiskies. And Middleton, the whiskies that you're trying from what I've seen, you're focused on the pot still whiskies. Green Spot, Yellow Spot, Powers 12-year-old. There's a few others, Redbreast, Cask Strength. These are single pot still whiskies. And one of the unique characteristics of a single pot still whiskey is its texture. and there's a creamy texture, a mouth coating. If I was to, as I sip on Yellow Spot, as I roll that around my tongue and my teeth, it puts a little fur, a little coating on my teeth and on my tongue. That is a common element associated with a pot still whiskey because of the unmalted barley. So we're familiar with single malts, and they come from one single distillery, and it's malted barley, and that's the 100%, that's the ingredient. Obviously, a pot still whiskey contains a mixture of malted barley and unmalted barley. Barley that comes out of the fields, is not malted, is not tricked into germinating, is not put in a dark room and tricked into thinking it's springtime so that it'll release its inside seed. This raw barley, when it's added to the mash, reacts differently to the yeast, performs differently through distillation, so that the spirit you get out the other end of that distillation has a different consistency, a different texture. And as you roll it around the glass, I've always noticed with a single pot still whiskey, it sticks to the side of the glass, not just because of the alcohol content, but there is a viscosity to single pot still whiskey that I would say is unique. Now, if you take another whiskey from Middleton like a Jameson, I'd argue that you don't get that. And that the reason you won't get that same texture is because Jameson is predominantly a corn whiskey, a grain whiskey, mixed with single pot still. And that viscosity, that creaminess takes a back seat to the lighter, more floral grain whiskey that is a component of it. So as you move away from just the Middleton single pot stills and you get into double distilled single malts and blends from around Ireland, I think you'll see some changes there. But you've correctly identified, I think, that consistency and that texture in the single pot still.
I find that very seductive, and that's not a word I use a lot. And that seductive could be dangerous. One of the comments,
becomes expensive.
About the Green Spot Louisville Barton. And one of the things comments I made in my video is, this is a whiskey you're going to want to hide somewhere, because every time you see it, you're going to have to hold your hand back from grabbing it, because that's going to be the one and it's going to be gone really, really, really quick.
It's a great whiskey.
I love that whiskey.
Great whiskey.
But I find that textural element very, very, very seductive, very, very approachable, and the way it glides across your palate, which then makes it easier to just drink another one.
Well, isn't that what they want?
Yes. But there is a need to pace yourself and savor the moment and be in that moment and sort of shut the rest of the world off. You know, if you're watching television, mute it, during the commercials and whatever else you got going on, and just kind of be in the moment and
focus on it. Yeah, think about it. I'm
finding, and words fail. I can't put not everything I can convey in words, more like emotions and feelings and like that. But I'm finding there's something very, very unique that I'm absolutely loving about Irish whiskey.
The first question, like, we can get very academic about whiskey, and you as a qualified, certified whiskey specialist and wine ambassador, and you have great qualifications to support your interest in whiskey and wine. Yet there's nothing that can prepare us for that moment when you find that whiskey or that wine where you're lost for words, where all of the nosing descriptions and palate descriptions and flavor profiles elude you, because all you can do is look at it. You hold that glass up and you look at it, and perhaps you shed a little tear, and maybe you just you giggle a little bit. Like, I'll never forget the first time I poured a drop of Redbreast 32-year-old Dream Cask into a glass, and I sipped on it and I laughed out loud. Uncontrollably, couldn't control it, involuntary action. It was that good. There was no words, and there needn't be any words. That was sufficient response to what was in that glass. And I find that the greatest whiskies elicit responses like that, where words fail us. Maybe we just glance at the person next to us and they can tell immediately, and they'll just nod and go, yeah, we get that too.
For a whiskey tour, that's challenging, because I get people go, man, Erik's really excited. He's really energetic. That's part of, as much as part of the review as anything else I might say in terms of descriptors. It's how excited I get about a particular whiskey. But there's also, I get this,
yes,
or wow, oh wow, wow.
But you have to.
It's hard. That's hard to. What does that mean? Well, how many? Erik gave that one 5 wows and 6 mms. But you really find yourself being in that moment, just absolutely loving this whiskey.
Well, those are the moments we seek out, aren't they? I mean, that's why we're interested in whiskey. There's a reason. You mentioned at the start of the show how you started out in wine, and now you're down these. Like, I can't see a bottle of wine behind you. I can only see whiskeys, and there's a reason for that.
They're
over there.
Yeah, they're over there.
But you went down a whiskey rabbit hole, and you went down that rabbit hole because you found those moments of ooh, right? And we can get very academic with whiskey. Like, are you getting the nose of the outboard engine, the diesel fumes from an outboard engine on a motorboat? And most people will be like, no, I'm not getting any of that. And so to me, it's always about, but do you like it? Let's start there. Do you like it? And if I see somebody taking a sip and smiling, I don't even need to ask them. I'll just nod and smile with them. And that's why I love whiskey, is that I don't have any academic background. I have no intention of getting it. All I want to do is meet nice, interesting people who share a love for moments like that, be it through the whiskey or through a conversation we might have. And that, to me, is what makes whiskey so special.
So one of the things is, if you and I are going to share a bottle of wine, it has to be at the same time.
Right.
We get together for dinner. We go out to dinner. Maybe I bring a bottle to the restaurant, pay the corkage fee. We have a great wine. We have a great dinner. If we aren't together, we can't share that bottle.
Right.
Versus I can open this bottle or another bottle of whiskey, and then we get together 6 months later. We can share it then.
That's
I can't
true.
do that with a bottle of wine. Unless you're there when I open it, or maybe the next day, we can't share it together. So these whiskeys, I've had them, I've reviewed them, I love them, but I can share them. I can pour samples and send them off to people, stuff like that. You can't do that with wine, because what they will get when it arrives is vinegar.
See, you've answered your own question there, Erik. What you have to do now is you've got to go over to those wine shelves, and you've got to take your hand and just run it along the shelves and throw all those wines into the bin so that you can make space for a whiskey. And that way you can share it with people for years and years and years.
Though I actually have wine refrigerated units over here.
Professional grade.
Yeah.
Look at you.
And most of the wines are in there are very high end Bordeaux, going for $125 all the way up to $1,000. So no, I'm not.
Send me over your address there. I'll be up in a minute.
Yeah, I've got a lot of money in there in wines, but I don't review them anymore, and a lot of them need another 5 to 10 years before I can.
So what are you going to do with that now that you've discovered the joy of sharing whiskey? Like, you're an enthusiastic ambassador for whiskey. You created a show, you talk about whiskey, and wine has taken this back seat to a degree. So what's going to happen to all that wine that you have? Is it that you're going to wait for people to come over to the house, or what's going to happen?
Well, I still drink them. I just don't review them. I don't do the videos anymore.
Okay.
So when I'm not having whiskey, I might have a couple days where I'm not having whiskey. Pop a cork. So I have a 3-bedroom house here. One of my brothers lives with me. He's a much better cook than I am. Much better cook than I am. So sometimes he'll cook something, and since he's doing the cooking, I'll pop a cork and we'll have wine with dinner. But I'm not spending the money I used to. So $100 bottle of wine, once you open it, it's gone. $100 bottle of whiskey, it's still going to be good for a while. At some point you can become oxidized or whatever.
But you say that now. I've seen a picture of your your Powers John's Lane that didn't last very long at all. No. I saw you making good progress in that bottle.
Yeah, that only took a couple days. Yeah, that was. I really liked that one. That was absolutely superb. Absolutely superb. So I'm going to ask you a question which you may not want to answer. Do you have any favorite Irish whiskeys?
Well, you might see what's on my little plinth here that I'm drinking. This would be in my top 3 whiskeys of all time that I've ever tried. Redbreast 27-year-old. It would be my favorite of the continuously available non-special release whiskeys. But look, you know as well as I do, whiskey and your enjoyment of whiskey changes with the minute, with the moment, with the meal. My breakfast whiskey might be different than my dinner whiskey, and I find that whiskey has always tasted best to me with people and with friends, and I get the most enjoyment out of it. But saying that, I find it very hard not to be drawn back to Redbreast as a brand. I grew up 12 miles from the Midleton distillery that produces Redbreast. I've gotten to know the blenders and the distillers and the people in Midleton. I have an emotional connection to that place, so close to my home. And the fact that the whiskey is so good, just is the icing on the cake to me. So when people ask me, you know, what's the greatest Irish whiskey to try, I'll say simply, look, start with a bottle of Redbreast 12-year-old. And if you like that, start working your way up the category and then come back and thank me when you get to 27. So Redbreast to me would be any of the Redbreasts. You won't see me turning down a glass of Redbreast.
And that's very, that's probably, although not necessarily 27, because a lot of people can't afford it or can't get it. But the Redbreast is probably one of the most common. They would say is sort of the flagship or one of the best representatives. I like the Lust style a lot, but the cask strength for me is just absolutely fantastic. Not had the 27 yet. Not had the 27 yet. But really looking forward to. I have a Glendalough Mizunura, which I'm looking forward to getting into. So let me maybe get off on a tangent here.
Let's go for it. So
casking in Scotch whiskey. Just this past, I think it was last June, they approved the use of tequila and mezcal casks. And so I did a review of a Doors mezcal cask, and has a little smokiness to it from the mezcal. I don't know if you're familiar with mezcal. It's basically a smoke. Tequila. And one of the thoughts that went through my mind was, it tasted blind. Would I think this was mezcal, or would I think it was a softer peat from Islay? And so they're not allowed to use anything that had apples or so you can't use Calvados casks.
Right.
And maybe people don't understand why. If you could use a Calvados cask, you would be imitating flavors that are usually derived from somewhere else, apple and pear. And so you can get apple and pear from a Scotch whiskey without using Calvados. So, or Don Frontes. So that's, prohibited. So the question is, and you're supposed to stay with the identity of Scotch, identity of Ireland or bourbon. There are some people who don't like finished bourbons. I have the Joseph Magnus, which are absolutely superb, but it tasted blind. I would never guess that was a bourbon.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion, or you think, on cask finishing? Could you be kind of overdoing it too much to where you start to lose something that is distinctively Irish?
It's a great question. There's a file called the Technical File in Ireland. It's a government file. It was created by the Irish government in connection with the Irish whiskey industry. The Technical File. It's enshrined into law in Ireland and in the European Union. And it's the law and the legislation that governs what Irish whiskey can and can't be. It allows for the maturation of whiskey in any type of wood. It doesn't have to be oak. It can be any type of wood at all. But what it does say is that the end result must resemble the characteristics of whiskey. And that's similar to Scotch. But what that does is that it ensures that you can't have crazy finishes or crazy flavors that in no way resemble what whiskey is or should be. And I'll give you an example of that. I'm going back 20 years ago. There's a famous Irish brand that many of you will be familiar with called Bailey's Irish Cream.
Yep.
Believe it or not, the same company that made Bailey's are responsible for Redbreast. Gilbey's were the ones behind Redbreast, behind Bailey's. And Gilbey's came out with a Bailey's whiskey 20 years ago. And it lasted on the market for 6 months before it was pulled from the market because it was deemed to be too far removed from what whiskey should be in flavor. In other words, the Bailey's component of that cream, that Irish cream, had overtaken to the point where it really wasn't whiskey anymore. So we have protections in place. Now, some people would argue those protections are limiting and prevent certain innovation. But I would also argue that those are great protections to ensure that we don't have peanut butter flavored whiskey, God forbid, in Ireland. And I'm in San Diego, the home of peanut butter whiskey. But all I can say is, let's hope we never see anything like that in Ireland, that we can stay true to our history while innovating in authentic ways. So I think barrel finishes are fantastic. Like, for example, I have a whiskey here, Middleton Very Rare Dargaelic. And Dargaelic is the Irish word for Irish oak. And what this is a single pot still whiskey that has been finished in a virgin Irish oak barrel. And Irish oak is not very good for aging long term.
So from Irish trees.
Irish trees, yeah. So there was
wow.
a time in the 1800s, 1700s when Ireland was covered in oak trees. Various reasons they were cut down. The British cut down a lot of those trees to use them in British warships. If you go to London, the Houses of Parliament, the floorboards of the Houses of Parliament are made of Irish oak. Irish oak now is protected. It's a protected species. You need a special license to grow it, to cut it down. The Midleton Distillery works with a number of forests and a number of landowners in Ireland to grow Irish oak, to protect Irish oak. And so they fell a number of trees every year and they turned them into oak barrels. And it's a long process of the tree has to reach a particular age in terms of maturity. And when it's cut down, it then has to be sawed, sent off to Spain to be turned into, quarter sawn into barrels, comes back to the distillery. But in any case, what we have here is a finishing period in an Irish oak cask. That is a remarkable contribution to the world of Irish whiskey, because we now get to taste this Irish wood influence when 99% of Irish whiskies have no Irish wood influence. They have American wood, European oak, right? And so I'm a big fan of finishing. What I'm not a big fan of is peanut butter whiskeys or apple flavored, like Paddy Bee Sting whiskey or liqueur or whatever that is. Like those, I think those are abominations, but we've got some great opportunities, and like whiskey bonders and whiskey bottlers taking great whiskeys that come from great distilleries and saying, now what if we took that whiskey and then we put it into a mezcal cask? For example, here's an Irish whiskey that has spent time in a mezcal cask.
Oh, okay.
It's from the whiskey bonder J.J. Corrie, and this was created for a store in California, in Folsom Advanced Spirits. But this is a blended, or is this a single malt? No, it's a single grain, 9-year-old single grain that was aged in bourbon and then finished in ex-mezcal. Now, this doesn't taste to me to be peated, but I can definitely get that smoke, that smoke that we so typical of a mezcal.
So usually, this is a very different live stream, because usually I'm more in the teaching mode, conveying of information than of receiving. But because I haven't spent a whole lot of time with Irish whiskeys, I'm really, really enjoying this and getting a lot. But I'm gonna say, and I usually interact with the people in the chat. I kind of feel like I've neglected a little bit. I see a lot of my usuals there. Wheels is in there, Don Morant is in there, Rich is Z in there, and there are 47 other people in there.
Great questions.
If you have a question for my guest, for Barry, highlight it with my name, so it'll show up in orange, and then I'll pass that question on to Barry. So if you have any questions, just put it in there. We've been at this for a little over an hour and 12 minutes, and I'm having a great time. The hour is just flying by.
I'm not going anywhere.
Questions, be sure to put it in there. And if you haven't already, give a like, give a thumbs up to the video, and in the description box down below, as I said earlier, there is a link to Stories and Sips down below. And if you have a Facebook account and you want to get more involved, learn more about Irish whiskey, you're going to look for
Irish Whiskey Fans of America.
Irish Whiskey Fans of America, and just mention my name and you get a $5 discount.
Even better, I let you in free. How about that?
There you go. And then there's also the Irish Whiskey Magazine, which comes out 4 times a year. So Steve A asks, what does Barry think about, I should read the question before I read it out loud. What does Brian think about Brian Nation moving from Middleton? Oh, okay. What does Barry think about Brian Nation moving from Middleton to, I don't know how you pronounce that, Shaughnessy in Minnesota?
So
I don't know even who that is.
Yeah, so if you look at your bottle of Middleton Very Rare that you have on the shelf, Eric, you'll see a signature on that bottle, and that's the signature of Mr. Brian Nation. Oh, he was the master distiller for many years in Middleton. He's only the second master distiller to have his name on a bottle of Middleton Very Rare. And in a very surprising move this year, I woke up a few months ago to a press release from Irish Distillers, the parent company of Middleton Distillery, saying that Brian Nation was moving on. And that he would have a replacement in the form of Mr. Kevin O'Gorman, who has been in the Irish whiskey world for 30 plus years, but that Brian is moving to Minneapolis, to Minnesota. And I thought that is unheard of. I mean, look, in the Irish whiskey world, Middleton, let's be honest, is the pinnacle of your career. The master distiller at Middleton, making the most renowned Irish whiskies in the world. But I suppose the other way to look at it is, if you've achieved that so young in your life, is there anywhere else to go in Ireland? Yeah. And I'd imagine that there must have been a very interesting, exciting opportunity presented to Brian where maybe, and I have no evidence of this whatsoever, but maybe he gets to put his own stamp on things. Maybe he gets some stake in it. I don't know, but he gets to do interesting things for him. And look, you and I might say, oh, well, when you get to Middleton, that's the height of it. Brian might say that's only the beginning.
So the other thing is Minnesota, the snow doesn't thaw till the end of May and you start getting to June. It's cold there. It's cold.
Where are they going to mature their whiskey?
Yeah. So, well, there's an old Klingon proverb, pity the warrior who has slain all his foes, because then what are you going to do? But I could definitely see that. You go, you know what? Yeah, this is the top of the world, this and that, but I want to go do something different. I could definitely see that because he could go spend some time in Minnesota and then something else comes along. But I could definitely see as a creative person, there are people who left very, very, very high-end positions in large wineries or chateau, but they want to do their own. They leave Bordeaux to go down to the Sud-West.
But Erik, like if you look back 400 years, wasn't it the Irish coming over to America that brought their distilling methodology to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and looked at maybe the beer that was being made and said, hold on a second, why don't we take that beer and distill it? And why don't we make something that's a little bit more higher proof? And I would like to think that Brian is doing something that is completely natural to us Irish, which is to spread our wings out around the world and maybe take some skills with us. And I think that Minnesota will be richer for Brian and his family's presence.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what comes out of that. I don't think people go there for retirement.
It's not Florida, and it's not he's not going there for his 4 p.m. happy hour meal or his early bird menu, I'd say. No, he's looking to do something.
So now if I go to Ireland, other than visiting distilleries and hanging out in pubs, like for example, when I went to Scotland and after my first trip, I started watching videos and learned about the standing stones and these 5,000-year-old archaeological sites. So I started watching documentaries and videos. And then I'm visiting old churches and historical sites. California is very young. 100-year-old building here is, wow, that's old, right? Here in California.
Right.
So and I got a couple questions coming here. Other than distilleries and pubs, what else in terms of understanding Ireland, what I might also want to visit while over, you think?
Wait, do you think there's more than just distilleries and pubs in Ireland?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, look, Ireland is known as the land of saints and scholars, and literature and the creative arts are part of who we are. And we've been this small little rocky outpost on the west coast of Europe, sending our poets and our writers and our song writers and our artists overseas for many, many years. And I'd like to think that there's something in the water or the air in Ireland that if you breathe it in or drink it in for long enough, you'll start to hit on something that is unique to this island nation, which is a mixture of islandness, somewhat of an inferiority complex, being under the thumb of a British ruler for 800 years, a confidence that maybe belies our size, all of these things mixed together, our humor. There's something there that you can't put a word on it. But what you'll start to find, Erik, I'm sure, as you meet people in Ireland, and you might meet them in a pub, you might meet them in a distillery, you might meet them while you're waiting for your baggage in the airport, and they might invite you for a cup of tea. And the conversations you'll have will start to uncover what Ireland is, because I'll come back to that point of it being a state of mind, it being something different. It's a different pace of life. It's not Caribbean pace of life in the sense of we're just laid back to the point of we're shutting down shop in the afternoons and we're doing nothing, but rather there's something spiritual about Ireland. You don't have to be religious to get it. And I think you have to soak it in. So I always say to anyone who asks me about what they should do in Ireland, I say, sit down with somebody in Ireland and let them talk and just listen and let them talk. And what they'll do is they'll share more than you'd ever have dreamed of asking, and it'll give you wonderful answers about what Ireland is. So that would be my advice.
So when I was on the Isle of Arran, before I did a tour of Arran Distillery, they have a little cafe there. And so before doing a tour, I had lunch there with a little bit of haggis and stuff. And a gentleman, a native of the Isle of Arran, came up. He was older than I am, probably 10, 20 years older than I am. Come up and he goes, "Do you mind if I sit down here?" I'm like, "No, sure." So he sat down, and for 15 minutes, I talked with this native of the Isle of Arran, and he says this is what he likes to do: is he doesn't travel around the world. The world comes there, and he sits down and talks to them. And I just really, really enjoyed the conversation, talking to this gentleman and hearing his stories there. So it'd be the same sort of thing as maybe the people in Ireland aren't traveling around the world necessarily, but the rest of the world is coming there, and they hear the stories there, and I really enjoyed it. So one of the viewers here, Richie Z, he said, "Can you ask Barry about Waterford?" Now, Daniel and Rex have been over there, and Scott and Bart from Scotch Distilleries have been over there. As much as I know, is they're doing something terroir-like, and the gentleman who was at Bruichladdich, now they're at Waterford. So what more can you tell me about Waterford?
So Waterford Distillery is a new distillery. They only released their first whiskey this year. It is housed in an old Guinness brewery on the banks of the River Suir in Waterford, which is on the southeast coast of Ireland. It was founded by a man called Mark Rainier, and Mark Rainier famously bought the Bruichladdich distillery when it was mothballed. He wrote a letter. The romantic story goes that he wrote a letter to the owners of that distillery, of that building, of that site, for many years, until they finally agreed to sell it to him. He was told when he was in Bruichladdich in Scotland, he was told that the best barley in the world grows in Southeast Ireland. And so when he sold Bruichladdich, he decided that it was time to go find this great barley. And so he came to the southeast of Ireland, and he is well funded and well backed. And after his success at Bruichladdich, you can understand why. And he with investment bought this old brewery, which had all. I mean, look, a brewery and a distillery are not that far apart. You don't need many more different components. But he had this fantastic building that was ready to go. So he decided to create a distillery focused 100% on Irish single malt whiskey. So it is a remarkably expensive, unnecessarily complicated, by choice, much longer process of making whiskey for good reason. So Mark has this belief that if we could focus on the main ingredient of whiskey, barley, and we were able to, if we were able to preserve the goodness that is in that grain all the way through distillation and casking, etc. And if we were able to separate perhaps the different farms that we took that barley from and only distilled one farm at a time, so that we could track the differences between the farms, that over time we'd start to learn the differences between a farm that was close to the coast, a farm that was inland, a farm on a certain gradient, terroir, which Erik, you're very familiar with from the French wine world. That the land, terroir meaning really of the land, the unique characteristics of soil and weather and place and gradient and all of these elements coming together would create different types of barley in different fields and different farms that overall could contribute to perhaps the most complex yet unique single malt ever made in Ireland. And so that's their big gamble. They distill at a slower rate than other distilleries. They don't use enzymes in their fermentation. They don't distill at capacity. They distill one farm at a time. They separate their barley in different bays in a massive cathedral of barley so that no farm's barley touches another farm's barley. And they buy extremely expensive barrels from like Neoc, New Age, New Era wine casks. I've seen names on the sides of their barrels that would, what they probably don't want to talk about publicly, but that would represent the very expensive chateaus in France and Bordeaux. Oh. And so they're putting a lot of their money into both the barley and then the final aging element. They just released their first whiskey, which is barely 3 years old. And if you or I sampled an average 3-year-old whiskey from any other distillery in Ireland, Erik, you might look at me and say, if that's Irish whiskey, I don't really want to be a part of it. Whereas with Waterford, you sample a 3-year-old whiskey and you wonder, is it 10-year-old? Is it 12-year-old? Because the care that has been taken to disseminate every step of the way. Like you can take 3 or 4 main steps in the process of making whiskey, from malting to fermenting distilling, maturing. And they've said, no, let's turn the 4 steps into 400 steps, and let's analyze each step, and let's make them not just more efficient, but rather, well, what's the best thing we should do for the sake of the whiskey at the end? And that's an expensive process. But I'll tell you that what has come out the other end is a whiskey like I've never experienced or tasted. And they're just about to launch in the United States. And I personally have high hopes for what they're going to do to change the perception and change expectations. And even, I would say, mobilize consumers to ask more questions about origins of barley, process. So Waterford for me is the most exciting distillery in Ireland right now, hands down.
So one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is when someone does something revolutionary, it tends to it's like someone dropping a big rock in a pool. It goes, whoosh, it spreads out. The 1976 judgment in Paris, in which Dr. Montelena with the Chardonnay beat the French. It had this worldwide impact. In Scotland, there's about 300 different barley varietals. I'm using a grape term. There are only about 10 are commonly used. Most of the time, they're choosing barley based on the yield, as well as resistance to molds and that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, but it's more in terms of alcohol yield. I have some books. I've got a couple hundred wine books. I've got maybe 40 or so whiskey books. And I look for, they're not all the same. They say different things. And what you most commonly hear, particularly from Scotland, is it's all about yield. It's all about yield.
Yep.
There isn't that much difference between one and another. So, Golden Promise, we can get better yields out of this. So we're going to use this strain instead. Where some say, no, we think something unique comes out of Golden Promise. There's some distilleries in Texas using Golden Promise. If it proves out an application of what his belief is, and I believe he had a wine background as well, it'll go, people like, people will rethink their thoughts about barley and its impact. And there's yeast choices. There's a gazillion little choices you make, but I think it will have an impact on the rest of the world, and people refocus on particularly barley strains. And it's not just about nitrogen levels and how much alcohol.
Well, that's it.
But
100%
character as well.
100%. Look, the slow food movement in the 1980s focused us back on a slower pace of life and on taking our time to make our food. Why? Because it's not about speed. It's not about how fast can I get to the table. It's about community. It's about quality. It's about getting the best out of a thing. So yes, you're absolutely right. Barley, brewing barley, distilling barley has been grown for the past, I don't know how long, 50, 100 years, all about yield. How much can we get per square meter in our field? With Waterford, so Waterford is the only distillery in Ireland that employs a full-time agronomist. And her name is Grace O'Reilly. And Grace is the agronomist. And Grace's job is to work with the farmers to help them understand the type of output that Waterford needs in order to make the best whiskey. And that means helping the farmers understand that it's not about yield. It's instead about the quality. It's about the protein. It's about the protein levels that are in that barley. And if they're not at the grade that Waterford needs, they just won't be part of it. Now, that means that there may be a lower return for farmers, because if farmers are working on bulk and they're working on yield and they're working on, okay, we can supply more and more, maybe they'll get more for their crop. But what we're seeing in Ireland now is we're seeing an increasing number of farmers who are coming to the table saying, yes, but where's our barley going, and what becomes of it, and can we be proud of it? And now Waterford Distillery are releasing videos where they'll go to the home of the farmer and they'll sit down with the farmer and his wife and their kids, and they'll talk about the joy that the farmer has in seeing his name on a bottle of whiskey, because they were able to work with the distillery and create something together that neither one of them could have done on their own. That, to me, falls perfectly into this unique, into what Ireland is known for, which is not just whiskey, but storytelling. The farmer now gets to tell a story. We get to tell a story about a farmer. Like, I've got a few bottles of Waterford over here, and each bottle has a different farmer's name on them. That, to me, is fantastic, because if I like that whiskey, maybe I'll go to Ireland and maybe I'll want to meet that farmer, or maybe he'll have a cup of tea with me. And I love that, but it's not about yield anymore. Now, saying that, Waterford is located an hour from the Middleton Distillery, which is producing the most Irish whiskey in the world. And they're using a lot more grain, but they have to work on yield, don't they? I mean, they're working on a very different system. Now, whether Waterford can have an outsized impact and punch big and say, we're going to change consumer perceptions is yet to be determined. But I'll tell you this, in the food world, we've already become accustomed to asking questions about where something comes from.
Yep.
Why is that any different from whiskey? Just because historically it's not been declared. Look, let's be honest. I mean, look, Jameson contains French grain. We don't talk about that. French grain, who knows that? Who knows that the majority of Jameson is not from Ireland?
Well,
Waterford,
most of Scott's whiskey is not made from whiskey come from Scotland either.
Right. There you go. So I think we're at a moment now where a outspoken man with firmly held beliefs is going to divide opinion in the best of ways, because I can get behind a man with beliefs all day long, whether I agree or I don't agree. If he can back up his beliefs, I'm in his corner. And Mark Rainier has proven that he's got beliefs and now he's got good whiskey. So right. The rest is still to be determined. But in any case, I'm very excited about Waterford.
But it's not like, I'm always bringing parallels from the wine world over naturally, but it's not like now every distiller is going to do what he does. No. There's a special place. There's a special niche, special consumers who that's what they're into. That's what they want. Not everybody geeks out. Not everybody has these kind of most whiskey consumers don't go this nerdy, and they do not watch whiskey tuber channels that go this geeky and nerdy. They don't.
That's right.
Most people want entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not my channel's not for everybody. Some want more the goofy, and I can get goofy, especially if I had a few of these. But the goofier, sillier, hang out, and that's fine. But there's going to be a certain group they're going to go, man, I really, really, really dig what they're doing, the vibe, and they're really, really going to get behind it as well.
Yeah, so, I agree.
Ask a question. Don Lawrence asked about Blackwater traditional pot stills. So they're doing something. Yeah. And one, are they doing something different? And two, are they available here in the United States that you know of?
Blackwater Distillery is really interesting. It's in Waterford, not far from the Waterford Distillery. And so you might argue that there's something very unique in the water in Waterford, because you've got two very outspoken owners of distilleries, Mark Rainier of Waterford Distillery, Peter Mulryan of Blackwater Distillery, and I absolutely love their positions and their stances. Blackwater Distillery is making whiskey in a way that is historically accurate in terms of its designation. So they're making what would have been called pot still whiskey 50 or 100 years ago, but today doesn't fit the technical file or the legal definition of what pot still whiskey is. And what they're doing is, and interestingly enough, they have an American distiller who's come over from the rye whiskey world into Ireland to make whiskey in Ireland. But what they're saying is they disagree fundamentally with how whiskey in Ireland is defined today by law, that the criteria to be a single pot still whiskey is at odds with how it was historically. And why is that an important thing to argue, you might ask? Well, if we look back to the late 1700s and much of the 1800s, Irish whiskey was the most consumed whiskey in the world. And the whiskey that was being consumed the Irish whiskey that was being consumed was single pot still whiskey. Heavier texture, creamy, spicy. But the formula and the mash bills of the 1800s would have had quantities of wheat and oats and rye and other ingredients in there that don't fit the qualifications today. So you might ask, well, how do those qualifications change? We're back in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, when they had to enshrine or revisit these directives. The government, the Irish government and the representative body of Irish whiskey looked to the only distilleries in Ireland. And then the only distillery really making any whiskey of significance was Middleton. So the Middleton Distillery got to provide their input as to what single pot still whiskey was, which strangely enough was remarkably similar to the style of single pot still whiskey they themselves were producing. So you might argue there was some level of protectionism, but I would say it wasn't in any way malintended. Rather, it was, hey, we're the only distillery of note keeping the Irish whiskey world alive. Shouldn't we keep this going? And they hit on a formula that was basically a single pot still whiskey must contain no less than 30% malted barley, no less than 30% unmalted barley, and a maximum of 5% other. And other could contain wheat, oats, corn, whatever you wanted. But back in the 1800s, single pot still whiskey might have had 30% corn or oats, right? And so if you made a whiskey today with 30% oats, you couldn't call yourself a single pot still. So what Blackwater are saying is, well, that's not historically accurate. And while they have a point, in many quarters, people will say, yes, but you built a distillery knowing that these are the new laws and these are the new Irish whiskey directives. So what we have is this little bit of agitation where Blackwater will say, yeah, well, we don't agree, so we're making our own thing, and that's fine. But hopefully what that also encourages people to do is say, well, maybe we can push for change or reevaluation or examination of what determines or defines the Irish whiskey category. I don't imagine that's a very quick process, and I don't think that just one distillery alone is going to achieve that. But if the likes of Peter Mulryan and Blackwater and others are putting out interesting whiskies, perhaps the groundswell of support, if it's there, will push the Irish whiskey world in a direction that allows there to be greater definitions and allows for more innovation. Until that happens.
Or a new classification, a new
right.
designation.
That's right.
So one of the posts I had put in the Irish Whiskey Fans of America, which then made its way into one of my videos, so I had realized there was no category for blended blended malt. And that's historically, if you understand the consolidation of distilleries, it makes sense. But as someone rightly answered, my post probably you, and then which would then made its way into my video is, well, once there are enough distilleries, do you have a lot of more single malts? Maybe someone will come along, and there's already two.
That's right.
But they're not labeled Irish blended malts. But maybe
that's right.
Category will get legislated, and so maybe what's going on there at Blackwater will get its own designation. Not necessarily that they would change a single pot still whiskey, but they might come up with a new category. But if they're the only people doing, if they're the only ones doing it, they're going to come up with a whole new classification just for this group, though.
Well, look, we have this unique opportunity in Ireland. We have, Irish single pot still can only be created on the island of Ireland. Yes, there are distilleries like Talnua in Denver that are making pot still whiskey, single pot still. It's not Irish single pot still, but it's in reverence and deference kind of to Redbreast. But we have this unique opportunity, I think, in Ireland to say, if we've got this unique style, and Redbreast and Green Spot and Yellow Spot, they're out there, and Powers John's Lane are showing the world what single pot still can be. Would it behoove us perhaps to examine where we could go from there? Because if I was to recreate, or if the Middleton Distillery was to recreate what a single pot still was from the John's Lane, the old Powers John's Lane Distillery in Dublin, it wouldn't be the same mash bill that you have in your Powers John's Lane today. But maybe that is an opportunity to show, here's how historically it was distilled. Here's why that's interesting. Here's all the stories to go with oats and wheat and all kinds of other things. But I don't know. I think we're missing an opportunity to revisit the historical mash bills now that for the first time in a generation, there's a global interest in pot still whiskey. This couldn't have been done 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. You couldn't get Redbreast on a shelf in America 10 or 15 years ago. Now, every liquor store in America has a Redbreast on the shelf. That is a remarkable achievement. So now, why don't we stand on the shoulder of giants like Redbreast and allow Blackwater come in with a single pot still that doesn't follow the exact same formula, but stays within a parameter that we've all agreed on.
Right. So, I now see Redbreast in grocery stores. Not just specialty liquor stores, specialty whiskey shop. You can now see in aisles and grocery stores. That means it's really, really gotten out there. But the one thing about all this is studying history. Well, history is so interesting. There's always politics get involved.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Involved, and occasionally a little bit of religion gets involved, and money. It all gets wide. It all gets intertwined in there. But it'll be interesting to see. I'm 54 years old. and see how long I live, and to see where things are. When I'm 64 years old, and to see where things are 10 years from now, and I'll be able to look back at this time and say, "Oh wow, look how things have gone, and how much things have progressed." I think it's just fascinating to see the progression and to be in this particular time, in this particular moment in the history of
absolutely
of Irish whiskey, and just
you mentioned having to dive deep into understanding all of the areas of France, and needing that map. And I think we'd both agree that the complexity of the French wine industry surpasses the complexity of the Irish whiskey industry today. So now is a good time to jump into Irish to understand, because it'll never be as simple as it is today. And tomorrow it'll be more complex. Like just last week, a new distillery came online that they're only making smoky / peated whiskies in Ireland. Now that is a massive departure, where 10 years ago, nobody could have ever foreseen a distillery only focused on that. So
what was the name of the game?
It's called Sleeve League. Sleeve League.
And who's heading that up?
It's a man called James Doherty and his wife Moya. James and Moya are in Donegal in Northwest Ireland, and they're at the moment in the middle of a crowdfunding campaign. They just raised £1 million or €1 million, and they're heavily backed. And they're going to do amazing things, but they're going back to this old style. Like historically, Irish whiskey, especially in the northwest of Ireland and the west of Ireland, would have been heavily peated.
Yeah,
because the only fuel source to dry out that barley would have been turf cut out of the bogs. And when natural gas and coal came along, they were cheaper sources of fuel. And so most of Ireland moved away from peat. But so peat is not a uniquely Scottish thing. So now this distillery is saying, well, we have a history of smoky whiskies. Why don't we create a category of Irish whiskies that is so emblematic of our past, yet also takes advantage of distilling advances and methodologies today? So look, it's a really interesting time to dive into Irish whiskey. And if somebody as uneducated as me can get up to speed in a couple of years, it wouldn't take much for anybody else to do it.
So, and the thing is peated with, I mean, obviously, I got all this Isla right here. There are people who call themselves Pete Heads. In fact, sometimes I have someone in my chat. His name is Pete Head. He goes by Pete Head. There's a particular group, just like people who are like really, really into bourbons or really, really into ryes. There are people who are really, really, really into peated whiskeys, that sort of thing. And for me, my occasions for why I'm drinking this wine, usually it's food. What am I eating? But for whiskeys, it's what is the season? And for me, as it gets colder and you're heading into the holidays, I get more and more in the mood for more peated whiskeys. It's just
right
in the middle of summer and hot, especially when California's on freaking fire. I'm not in the mood for peated whiskey when California's on fire.
Well, you're closer to the fires than I am. I'm down here in the southwest corner. I'm fairly protected from the fires, but you're probably closer to them, are you?
Oh well, the sun is right there. It's pumpkin orange.
Is that right?
I can see the sun from here. It's pumpkin orange.
Yeah,
and I can't go outside. I'm asthmatic. I can't go outside and breathe. Anyway, but there is a particular people who are big fans of peated whiskey. So it'll be really, really interesting. So I'm going to have the Connemara here, and I have the Donegal blended. If I'm pronouncing.
Well, here's one for you. Look, this is a peated finish. This is from the Killowen, Ireland's smallest distillery, and this is a blended Irish whiskey. It's a sourced whiskey that they finished in an Islay cask. So a cask that previously held Islay whiskey, Scotch. They finished the Irish whiskey in it. It's a 10-year-old blend, and they've released it. And it's a very small smoke influence. I'm not a peated whiskey guy. My wife's a big smoky peated whiskey fan. She loves Connemara and
not a peated whiskey guy yet.
Yeah, that's what people keep telling me. But I mean, yeah, it depends how long I live, I suppose. There's enough to get through of non-peated, but I enjoy this. And I, give a shout out to Killowen, because Ireland's smallest distillery, doing really interesting things and sourcing some good whiskies while they mature their own stock. But they're also being very innovative, and they're another one of those agitators in the Irish whiskey world that is raising a stick at the clouds and saying, no, it shouldn't be this way. And they're trying to help change things for the better for consumers.
Right. Yeah. Glenlivet Nodura has a peated cask that they use, and it just gives it the finest element of smoke and peat. Maybe even sort of a good introduction. Someone who doesn't want the Ardbeg or Lefroy smack upside the head. Just a little bit of interest there on the finish there. So now, you're here in the United States. Is that available here, or do you have friends that send it to you?
The distillery sent this over for me to try it. It's available. It's not on the shelves in the United States, but it can be shipped in through Irish online retailers who'll sell it. So I know a whole bunch of Americans who have sourced Killowen from Ireland through online retailers.
Well, too bad we're not neighbors, or too bad I can't download. Here, pour me some. I'd like to try.
Here, come a bit closer there. We'll pour it in for you.
There you go.
But there's some interesting questions there that Erik that have been flying past, and there's one that I wanted to hone in on, and that's the ownership of Irish distilleries, which I think is an interesting point. And I can't remember who put the point in there, but it was mentioning. I think it was perhaps Donald. Mentioning how let me see, can't find there, but that Midleton is owned by Pernod Ricard, and Pernod Ricard is a French drinks company. There's been a few periods throughout Irish history that Irish whiskey has been on its knees, and the 1960s was one of those times. In 1965, Ireland was down to 3 distilleries in the Republic of Ireland. You had Powers in Dublin, Jameson in Dublin, and the Cork Distilleries Company in Midleton in County Cork. And there was a danger that the Scottish were going to come in, buy up those distilleries and shut them down to protect Scotland and protect Scotch. And it was thanks to the Powers family, who spearheaded conversations between the 3 families, who then amalgamated the 3 companies together under a very imaginatively named company called Irish Distillers, that Irish whiskey was saved. And when they moved their distillation, and they shut down Powers in Dublin, they shut down the Jameson distillery in Dublin, and they moved production down to Midleton in County Cork, that very egoless decision where you shut down distilleries that had your family name over the door, ended up saving Irish whiskey. But it wasn't enough, because in the 1960s and early 1970s, Scotch and bourbon were overtaking Irish whiskey sales. And so there was still the danger that Irish whiskey could disappear. And it wasn't until the French came in the 1980s for a friendly takeover to prevent Irish whiskey actually ending up in British hands. There was a danger that Grand Metropolitan, big British company, could buy up Irish distillers and make it a British company. The French came in and kind of rescued the Irish whiskey industry by buying Irish distillers. And the French being, of course, Pernod Ricard. We really have the French to thank for putting millions and millions of dollars behind Jameson and investing in the production and in the marketing of Irish whiskey globally. So while some people might look at Midleton and say, but sure, aren't they part of a French company? There are actually very few distilleries of big production capacity in Ireland that aren't owned by an international conglomerate. I mean, Teeling Distillery in Dublin has a huge share by Bacardi. Bushmills is owned by the parent company of Jose Cuervo. Glendalough Distillery is owned by Mark Anthony Brands that make the delicious / disgusting White Claw. So there's a lot of kind of, I wouldn't say globalization, but consolidation. But that's not to be feared, because Midleton Distillery operates as its own entity under the Pernod Ricard banner. So I'd hate to see anybody ignoring an Irish whiskey distillery because of the perception that they're foreign owned.
Right.
If anything, foreign ownership is giving some much needed funds to make Irish whiskey more widely available. So I just wanted to kind of chime in on that point, because I would consider Midleton to be a true Irish whiskey distillery, not because of its ownership, but because it's been distilling in Ireland for almost 200 years. So
this, again, the wine world, there's something very parallel to that. You have Chateau Louisville Barton. It's an Irish... It's an Irish family in Bordeaux that has owned this for quite some time. So, which is the reason why there's sort of a common heritage between Green Spot with the Louisville Barton cask finish. There is Saint Superi in the Napa Valley, which is French owned. There are wineries in the Napa Valley that are Chinese owned. There are chateaus in France that are Chinese owned. There are the Rothschilds are planting vineyards in China. There's going to be a Chinese wine that's going to be French. You can't buy property in because everything's owned by the Chinese government. but there are French investments in China to produce a Chinese wine out of there. So
Yes.
as long as they don't, for me, as long as the French don't come in here, California, and start making it a French wine, although it might be an improvement, but as long as they don't change the character of what's being made,
Yes.
it's a foreign investor, really. But the reality is okay, you and I, we're gonna start a distillery. How long are we going to be around? A few decades, and then someone else is going to have it. There's a certain sense in terms of land or ownership of anything on this planet, you're more of like a caretaker. You've got it for a little bit of time, and then some other generation is going to have it. And so you're a steward of this time, of this piece of land, of this vineyard, or of this field of barley, or of this forest, or of whatever it is, and someone else who didn't plant it, who didn't grow it, is going to become the steward. Is going to be caretaker after. And your 100%. Best hope is your hope should be that they do it justice, that they take care of it well for future generations, not necessarily who is making the money in their pocket out of it.
Well, that's exactly it, Eric. Like you hit on a great point, because if you look at the Midleton Distillery, and I see some of the questions there this will probably answer some of these questions. Brian Nation moving to Minneapolis, the master distiller from Midleton. The new master distiller, Kevin O'Gorman, who was the former master of maturation. In other words, his job was to oversee the wood sourcing, the barrel making, the maturation, the warehouse production, warehouse creation and building, etc. He now takes over as master distiller, and he gets to take his knowledge from the world of the wood maturation side of things and his previous background as a distiller, and he gets to apply them in the same distillery, knowing what is the essence of Midleton. So nothing about the production in Midleton will change to a point where we don't recognize it, despite the ownership, because look, a French drinks giant has probably not had a whole lot of input into who the master distiller was going to be after Brian Nation left. Let's be honest. Right. It was most likely somebody within Irish Distillers, the subsidiary, that said, well, Kevin O'Gorman's been here for 30 years and he used to be a distiller and he has created the world's most enviable wood management program. Maybe he's the man. And so I am delighted to see Kevin O'Gorman, who is a Cork man like myself, in the helm at Midleton, because it's in safe hands, and no more of a gentleman or an experienced man will you find than Kevin O'Gorman. So he'll put his own stamp on things, and I'd imagine we'll see some experimentation in wood coming to the fore. That's a good thing. And Brian Nation goes on to do his thing. But Midleton remains in an evolutionary and innovative manner, despite its ownership.
So what's the bottle you have there next to you now? Look.
This is the Dargaelloch, Midleton Dargaelloch. That's the Irish oak. And this is the one, it's called Knockrath Forest. And so the trees were felled in Knockrath Forest in Ireland. And those trees were turned into barrels that aged this, I think it's a 17 to 23-year-old single pot still whiskey. And that color, that beautiful natural color that you see in there is from the ex-bourbon and the Irish American oak influence.
Now, is that one you had sent over or brought over, or the one you picked up here in the United States?
It's now available in select markets in the United States. I bought this from Ireland and paid a small car payment to ship it over here, but I'm not unhappy with my purchase.
I can imagine.
Lives for living.
So someone asked you about the actual glass you're using. I think I've seen those around. It's a little different.
So this is what's called a Tuath glass, Tuath, which is the Irish word for community or family. And if you look at the base of this glass, it's pyramidal in shape.
Oh, yeah.
And this pyramid is a representation of a famous island off the southwest coast of Ireland called this Skellig Michael, where Star Wars was filmed. But what it allows us to do uniquely is we can lay the glass on its side like this, and I can pour a measure of Dargaelloch in there. A little bit coming out there, but I can pour this measure in here and it'll sit there nicely. So if I've got a tasting, I can lay the glass on its side. But it also, as opposed to a Glencairn glass, it's got a nice wide rim to the top. So people would, I've got a fine big nose. I can't get into a Glencairn glass, but I can get into this. So I can put my nose in here and it's flared on the outside, which pushes some of those alcohol vapors away from the nostrils. and it's got I think it's a bigger bulb at the bottom than it is in a Glencairn. So it's called a Tua glass, and this is a Stories and Sips Tua glass that are on my website if anybody wants them.
Oh, and they're available. Okay. Then I know.
I'll send you up some. Give me your address. I'll send you up some.
All right, and I gotta send you one of these. This for my channel. It's got my mug on there, and these are huge, made out of metal.
Nice.
So one of the traditions, it started off, I think Scotch Test Dummies down in Kansas started this. Most of the other, they're called challenge coins. The tradition comes from the military. Most of them are the same material as poker chips. So we kind of trade them, sell them. Some people use them as channel raisers. I use them more in terms of just making a connection with people. Most of the time I prefer to meet someone and then hand it to them. But I've been, but now because of the COVID crap, I've been selling these out, and mine are bullet stoppers. These are hefty coins. I'm definitely.
That's the real deal right there. Mine are only made of wood, but yours are made of metal.
Oh yeah. This puppy's heavy. And the funny thing is, there's an inlay on it. So if you put my face down, it actually.
That's perfect.
So,
for anybody who noticed me spilling that Dargaelic as I tried to pour it into the Tua glass is welcome to come over to my house and lick the side of this to get the Dargaelic that has dripped down onto my table, which is an awful waste of whiskey, but I might be licking the table later.
But you need to get a cat that likes whiskey. Meow.
I'll be the cat.
Well, anyhow, so we've got maybe we'll stop it off at 2 hours. I could stay here all night long, but I'm getting ready for dinner. We're approaching 7 o'clock here. I haven't had dinner yet. So everybody, if you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up. If you're watching on the replay, give it a thumbs up. Down below in the description is a link to Stories and Sips. Definitely check it out. If you want to know more about Irish whiskey, become part of the Irish Whiskey of America, Lovers of America group, and become part of that community. Go on to Facebook and just search for it. Really, really great place for asking questions. I've really been enjoying it, as well as people sharing the bottles and so forth that they've had on there. So definitely want to check that out. And I'm really excited about. I mean, my journey. I said this earlier, but I was going into this just because it was a checkbox I need to check off, and I got to do some time in Ireland, and
right.
Category, gotta know, but my expectations have been far exceeded. Really enjoying.
That's good to hear. What's been your favorite, like so far? What's been your favorite Irish whiskey?
Wow. So the Powers was the most surprising. Just how much it changed from a neck pour versus once it got past the shoulder. A lot of sherry in there. That was really impressive. But I would say the Green Spot Louisville Baton probably. It's probably that one. Although the Redbreast cask strength, but the Redbreast, because I tasted it before, was everything I was expecting. There wasn't any surprises. They're really good. Don't get me. But I sort of tasted them before. But in terms of wow, first time having exposure.
Yeah.
The Louisville Barton really was fantastic, and the Powers was quite the surprise. I like the Middleton, very rare, but the quality price ratio, it's got a lot of it's very fancy, that kind of stuff. Friends of just this, what's in the bottle itself.
Sure.
And I'm glad about it. No regrets. It's very fine, it's very elegant. But I'll take 2 or 3 of the Powers over buying one of those.
No, I understand that. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, for sure.
But I've got a lot more to go, and I'll probably keep buying as more things come under the radar and more people share in the group. Ooh, what's that one? I got to get that one.
I know.
Problem with joining the group is people start sharing bottles. Oh, what's that one? That's
the danger. That's the danger. One of the things with the group, when I started that group, I wanted to create a community that we're all part of groups online that descend into all kinds of madness and chaos, and be it people sharing memes and irrelevant videos and politics. And so one of the goals of the group from day one was, look, this is a community. If you come in to just share links, there's no place for you. What we want is conversation and questions, and we want people to have what we call the crack in Ireland, which is just this non-translatable phrase for a good time. And the group has started to self-moderate in that way, where it is a remarkably kind community of like, you don't see people lambast somebody else for their choice of whiskey, and there isn't a place for them if they do, because it's not that kind of community. So that's a lovely thing. So if anyone has any interest in joining or any interest in Irish whiskey, please do come in. Your expertise, your interest, your insights, your questions would be very welcome. And friendships have been made in that group, and trips have been made because of that group. And I think the best is yet to come.
And I gotta say, definitely subscribe to the podcast. I find it makes the commute to and from work much more enjoyable. Sometimes you gotta listen to it more than once because I didn't understand the word someone said. I'm still learning to tune my ear to the Irish, so you definitely want to check that out as well. So what have you, in the last few minutes, what have you got coming down the pike? Anything special coming on? Any special guests? Anything, to keep our eyes out for?
Well, I think the biggest thing coming is launching my own whiskey, Eric. To be honest, I'm working with JJ Corrie, the whiskey blender in Ireland, and we have started the process of releasing our own Irish whiskey in a very limited release, and it is for the group, for our Irish Whiskey Fans of America group, and it's called Distillery, and it is a blended Irish whiskey made from as old as 30-year-old blend grains. And we're going to have it's going to be available in California for online sales before Christmas. But I'm really excited because my goal with releasing this whiskey was not to become wealthy or poor on the back of releasing a whiskey, but rather, could we document the journey of what it would take to bring a whiskey to market? So what we're doing is every week in our Facebook group, Louise, who owns JJ Corrie, Louise McGuan, the founder, she's sharing a video of the progress of this whiskey. Everything from the cask selection, the bottling, the labeling, the shipping, and ultimately arriving in America will all be documented. So our group gets to follow along on that journey. And then we'll have about 200 bottles available. That's about it. And maybe 400 miniatures. So it's a really small, limited release. But the goal is something for our community that tells the story of this evolving story of Irish whiskey and people coming together. So I'm really proud of what we've started, and I'm really excited to get into people's hands.
And I was so surprised. You saw my jaw drop. I think I hurt myself.
Yeah. Right.
Hey, you have been an absolutely fantastic guest. I've absolutely loved having you on. Definitely, we're going to have to do this again because as I get further down in my journey of studying Irish and learning about Irish whiskey, I'm going to have more and more questions. We'll definitely want to have you on again. But this has been an absolute delight. We went twice as long as I thought we would. But I've absolutely loved this. Has been absolutely fantastic. I want to thank you for coming on. I want to thank everyone for watching, and I'm going to tune out with an outgoing tune and another good Irish or rock song. But hang in there because I want to talk a little bit off stream as well. All right, until then, Solange.
Solange, Erik, thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.